So welcome to the tour. This would be the first place to begin, reading the publication, to give you some insights around the work, but hopefully this walkthrough will give you some kind of specific and concrete information about the works that people are more likely to ask about rather than the interpretive stuff that's going on within the publication. So let's start in here. So the titles, there's one work that's listed in here. Eva has, I have a present for you. Mind all the little pricks. In the end, we decided to not include that work because it felt a little bit lost in terms of the scale of it. So the works in the show are, I saw this post and then 2018. And so these works are created using, it's a technique called wool roving and needle felting, as well as some free motion embroidery. So I think the camera icon at the top would be constructed with machine embroidery, but when you're actually just moving the material around in order to create the shape. And then the wool roving is when this sort of fiber is laying quite loosely on the surface. So for instance, that image of the floodlight, the yellow is kind of sitting on top of the surface. And then the needle felting is actually working these fibers into the surface of the felt. It's like a commercial felt that you can purchase. It's not like handmade felt. And roughly each work she thinks of as kind of constituting a hashtag. So the images are chosen based on Google searches. And so if we think of each one as a hashtag, she's not really providing us what that text equivalent is, but all of these images are associated according to some sort of algorithm. And similarly to Eileen's work, working with this idea of Google, of the kind of plethora of images that are available to us, and this sense of trying to, my interpretive thing would be working it in these kind of needlecraft methods, puts the artist in the position of slowing down to really consider these images that are actually moving through our consciousness really quickly and kind of incessantly. If you Google wool roving or needle felting and hit images on Google, you find like really sentimental kind of crafty craft kind of objects. So it is part of this sort of craft movement within popular culture. And so by transferring it, I think, into this fine art context, she's kind of making a statement about particular kinds of craft. It's interesting because in this exhibition there are, three pieces that I would say engage with the idea of craft. The high art craft, and then there's low art craft, and then there's popular craft. And so she's very definitely pulling on the kind of references of, your sort of suburban craft shop kinds of creative activity. So knowing that each of them is a hashtag kind of is interesting because it sets up a situation where you start to draw associations between the images and then also start to kind of potentially construct sequences of when you may have seen them or how she's organizing them into this reference to a scroll, which of course is like a way of thinking of a narrative publication historically. And yeah, I just want to quickly just check and make sure. Right. Oh yeah, and so I think the other reference that, the other way she's thinking about scroll, or this idea of the continuous image, is also the idea of blog design. So that it's just like endless flow of information with the newest at the top and the oldest at the bottom. Any questions at this point, or?
I just have an observation that it's really hard to overcome the craft connotations of like fiber. Anytime it's used in work, it's like, you instantly have to talk about craft. Like, you just do, and it's like, even though it's been used a lot in contemporary art, it still always is very strongly tied to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's if you're interested in further reading, Rosika Parker's The Subversive Stitch is a great text to look at, because it sort of talks about how craft has historically, you know, at some point in history and in some cultures, was the, you know, kind of ultimate way of commemoration. Say within tapestry weaving, it was a kind of a form of history making, and it was done anonymously through, you know, medieval systems of artistic production were very different. So craft has had a very varied history in terms of whether or not it was considered a high art medium or not, and but even in contemporary art. Some fiber work within contemporary practices, like say Eva Hess in the 70s was working with fibrous material in abstraction, and so we've come in the contemporary practice to think of certain kinds of fiber as being a high art. She's making this reference now again to popular culture and contemporary image overload, a different kind of history, right? The blog is a different sort of historical form. The hashtag and the Google image is a different way of thinking about history. So then this is also Candace's work called Capture the Flag. And it's a combination of bead weaving on a loom and then patchwork. I think to patch the beadwork together, the loomed beadwork together. It also is, because it's sort of taking on this like bigger, chunkier sense of the grid, because the beads themselves are larger. It's less about the finesse and the fine craft of beading and more about the bling. And so her choice of the words are just inspired by current news coverage, and the reference and the font or the script is, you know, also very much, you know, relating to a particular kind of graphic design, digital graphic design. So I don't know, what do you think? What can you imagine this font being used for, say, in a graphic design sense?
Streets of Rage video game?
Yeah, yeah, I would say the same. Or it's because it's this sort of edgy, nihilistic kind of, you know, or maybe a food truck.
Yeah, I was thinking of restaurant, like the
Yeah.
name of a restaurant, or even on a T-shirt or something like that.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a sort of irreverence to
It looks
the
like graffiti.
graffiti.
Or
Yeah,
like with a paintbrush.
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's interesting when you think about digital fonts that are creating digitally, like mimicking the hand gesture, or this edgy sense of spontaneity, but you can actually just sort of pick it from your font suitcase. And And I think also the scale of the beads, you know, and the gold or the metallic kind of connects to fashion, I would say, in a sense, and a particular kind of fashion. Yeah, that is sort of based on the idea of kind of fairly temporary, not highly valued shininess. So, I don't think she's making a reference here to actual gold. I think she's making a reference to the metallics that we find now on our shoes and our bags and textiles. Capture the Flag is a game, is it not? So it's like a little war game?
Yeah, I mean, each opposing team has in their possession the flag from the other team.
Right.
And you have to go into their enemy territory, retrieve your flag, cross your lines again, and then you win, I suppose.
Right. So it's like this idea of a contest, of in social space, a kind of one-upmanship, and
But it requires like stealth. So
Right.
it's a sort of subterfuge or
right.
hegemonic that type of control.
Yeah.
It's a war game of sorts. It's just that you're not shooting people up.
Yeah, so it's like it's a war game that's not using violence, it's using kind of like skill or deceiving
Deceit,
or
yeah.
deceit, yeah.
Yeah, and it's territorial, so then when you start to think about those things and then think about the choice of the words, so like rank suggests a hierarchy, rules suggest the rules of a game, right suggests a right that you reenact. So all of those things are recombined into this system, which once again is like handmade. It's not, it's a reference to all of these things that are mass produced in terms of like the fashion idea, but it's quite arduously handmade. Okay, shall we move along? Has two pieces by Medea Sikander, and you're probably people familiar with this? Have anyone seen it before?
Yeah, Medea was kind enough to talk to us this morning, briefly for about 10 minutes when we were walking through.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
So what did she say, so I don't have to be redundant?
She talked about the idea of labor. She brought up this idea when she was having her crit, that many people, mainly male, in the studio practice, studio department, started to talk about labor and hierarchy. And maybe she's an artist who's asking other people back home to put in all this labor, and she really began to break that down. The idea that labor is actually a practice. It's a labor of being a brown woman, Muslim, having to labor and to practice, explain herself all the time about how legitimate she is, or how legitimacy works in terms of the way other people view her. She talked about this idea of the Alberti veil, in which the world is mapped out in grids, and the idea of looking through a veil past this in order to see past a Western perspective, through a curtain, looking at other things through the curtain, but also now trying to be self-reflexive of having the other person on the other side of the veil or the curtain now looking at you also in the same way. And she talked about just the amount of, not only labor, but collective and collaborative production that it takes to make a work of art. And that in studios in the West, if you were a male, to all the Jeff Koonses or the Rodney Grahams or the Jeff Laws, if you were a male, someone mentioned this in the critique, had she been male, they wouldn't have talked to her about her work in this way. That she wouldn't have to even deal with ideas about labor or about all these other things that are loaded in with her identity and with her background. And she says that in any kind of production, no matter what it is, it takes a team of people, hours of all kinds of logistical things that have to come together in order to produce a work of art. So trying to work through that veil, break the veil, work through it, see around it. You recognize that a work of art is never the creation of a solitary author. It's really by a host of people who come together in all different ways in order to present something. And she spoke of her mother, of her family, of how her mother wanted to allow her to be educated in Vancouver. Go for your dreams and try and do everything you can. And that part of that is also supporting the artist to be able to allow her to do all these things. And so she spoke about the amount of time it took for this to happen, all the people that she knew back home. There were also artists working with her. They were working 24/7.
A lot of students.
A lot of students that she had known. And also, one of the criticisms are you, the artist, getting everybody else to do your work. She says it's not just about the beading. It's not just about putting the needle through the clove. It's about making sure that everybody gets to my place on time. If the weather breaks and if it's monsoon season, all of a sudden everybody has to be like rushed home all of a sudden. How do you get all those people who are working with you safely back home? How do you feed them? How do you make sure they get breaks? How do you make sure that they are not being overcome with just the physical arduousness of being there? And how do you keep people's spirits up in this thing that's...
So yeah, art as this sort of complex social practice where the labor of it, so say for instance to compare it to a photograph by Jeff Wall, where there would be similarly huge numbers of people doing it and long periods of time to actually create the photographic image that then gets enlarged. This actually traces the labor it's directly indexed, so each of us can imagine the process of doing this thing. So that labor is indexed and transparent within the work. I think also she mentioned to me that the students and other people that worked with her in the construction of the piece, none of them really saw it in the flesh completed. So she was sending images back to all the people that worked for her or with her on it, and which is kind of like the same sort of convention as quilting or something like that, where each participant works on one section and then it gets recombined into this larger. So it's a different kind of monumentality, I would think would be fair to say. She also says that clothes are, like beaded clothes, where she comes from, are thought to have a kind of a protective function. So people would carry things like keychains or small objects of beaded clothes, that it's has a kind of a talismanic reference to protection. And then I think beyond the personal, there's also the kind of broader socioeconomic, political, historical context of the spice trails and spice exchange and markets and that kind of thing. So there's a sort of exoticism that is associated with it that actually is even within the scent of the work. She's also talking about the red and green as alternating these glass beads, which give these bands, as being a kind of, she's working a lot with duality, like being on one side or the other side, and the red and green as kind of occupying complementary places on a color wheel, but they actually, one intensifies the other. So there's a sort of aspect, a subtle aspect of a kind of dialogic relationship as a metaphor. I pointed out to her that this image is the image of her mother, that she had folded and scored in this diamond pattern in order to, was the technique to be able to scale it up into a larger drawing. She didn't recognize the diamond pattern as being connected to this. But I pointed out this way of, like this just visual diagrammatic reference being so strong between the two of them, the two of these works. And this, in a lot of ways, I think the two works speak about the same thing, about this idea of memory, of history, of the labor of drawing, and then also the way a photograph, when it's folded, it starts to, you know, it scores the emulsion, the paper shows through, so it feels that sense of memory and of wear and of tactility. That is still very akin, I think, for me to this idea of making something on this very small scale.
Also, the veiling seems to come in again as well.
Yeah. So this is her mother when she was roughly the same age as Medea is now. Okay, let's have a look at Christopher's work. So, Christopher Lacroix. So there are reasons for needing to remain unbound. These works, or these elements that constitute this work. And if you were to listen in, you would have the experience of listening to him speaking backwards. And this is essentially an index, I would say, for these other elements. So it's a durational performance that has been documented of him reading these texts backwards, and there are these two black journals that are there. So it's impossible to really discern the nature of what he's saying. And to me, what seemed to be more important is that this sense of speaking backwards is like doing this analog function of rewinding a tape. So video being a time-based medium, it's like reenacting or reperforming a function of recorded media. The other element that makes it durational is that it's, and I think he's very much inspired by a number of 70s performance artists that give themselves a task to be done over a long period of time so that it becomes a test of endurance. So as he reads these backwards, which is a very difficult thing to do, he is not allowed to leave the space of the camera. So while he reads backwards from time to time, he would just pee himself and keep going. And so how that is depicted in the piece is through these photographs that are taken at different points in the process. And they're taken by the artist, so you can see he's got a shutter release in his hand, and when he urinates, he just takes a shot. But you can also see that they're not in sequence, they're not in a chronology. And maybe suggest that it happened more than once during the process of reading all of these texts. So within this work, I think the sense of humiliation, of like this, of wetness, of exposure and display. A lot of the durational works, I would say, from the 70s by, especially by male performance artists, were quite about bravado. about endurance, and we're pretty macho. And I think Christopher's work is working with this other side of endurance, the humiliation, sacrifice, pain, and what's another couple of words that you can think of for this kind of self-deprecating?
Yeah, and when your dignity has to sort of be entangled,
Yeah.
and when you really have to think about your body space in a different way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how other people are reading you or perceiving you.
Yeah. And that kind of public humiliation, to sort of, very willingly put yourself in positions of being of public humiliation, of self-infantilization, makes it really uncomfortable, but it also, I think, potentially, in addition to maybe having people respond with a certain kind of vindictiveness or scorn, but it almost might also lead to a sense of empathy.
I know that he's like interested in occupying or reclaiming insults, the sort of position of an insulted person as a kind of like self-defense.
Mm-hmm.
So he did for his MFA roundtable, he gave this amazing presentation where he like traced a sort of diagram of being a faggot, reclaiming that term, and it having a relationship to like a bundle of sticks that's burnt at the witch trials. But then if you occupy the position of being wed, there's a kind of also like a connotation of queerness. The
Then
wet faggot cannot
you're
be burned.
inflammable.
So
Yeah.
you get this like little like water umbrella that's like
Yeah.
this protection against insult or aggression.
And I can't remember whether Erin talks about it.
She mentions
in
it really
that way,
briefly, but it's
in the
not like,
essay.
I don't think unless you knew
Yeah.
how he went into it, it doesn't like, it's just a really brief mention, but yeah, it was amazing. It was like fantastic, and it was such a performance to see him talk about it as well.
Yeah.
His talk was very performative as well.
So that brings up an interesting point about the level, degree of disclosure that artists will play with. Is sexuality important? Is it sort of on the top, in the top drawer of interpretive layers within the work? In an art gallery context, I think with an informed audience, I think the first thing is going to be the history of performance. I might be wrong, but that might just be me. But so the resistance to disclosing the content of the journals is like one layer of resistance, and then the fact that the journals are even more like they're boxed in this sort of hermetically sealed plinth. And then the sequence of this is also, we're disallowed from knowing the sequence. So it's a really interesting combination of disclosure and resistance.
It's even emphasized by the dress and the appearance the artist has taken himself. The mustache, the kind of 1970s gay male outfit, the denim and the white t-shirt. It's all very uniform, but then there's also that like weird individuality there too. The name of the artist and the diaries and stuff, so it's definitely attention.
So permeating our consciousness has been the sound of someone coughing, spitting, gagging. And as I think a really pretty direct reference to Vito Conchi's Gargle Spit piece, in that work, the artist it's a solitary image of the artist shot from above where water is being poured into his mouth and he gargles and spits it out. So playing with that sort of gag reflex. And here, Chris has turned it into this kind of much more dialogic relationship, but it's also quite funny, that this idea of trying to spit into someone else's mouth or trying to spit into your own mouth with the, which is what the technology of video allows us to do at this point, right? So it becomes a kind of a tautology in how he is imagining it. Any other comments? Like, what do you think about the way it's lit? His body is lit.
Can't help but think this is a bit of a number of years ago, Noam Gonick did a video piece and a performance about hazing, and he used football players from the Thunderbirds here on campus, the Unbound.
Oh, yeah.
And it was shot, I believe, in this blue, in which the number of, I don't know how many, 6 to 8 really muscular guys had their shirts off and had hoods over their head and were also tied either this way or this way. It reminds us of a lot of the things that were happening not only in Guantanamo but in other places where people are hooded and they're going through these hazing rituals. But these hazing rituals are things that are usually done in kind of a military kind of organization. And that's been transferred over into these sort of sports teams. But this blue light is reminding me of that. I never really thought about that until you mentioned the way it's been shot. Actually, I've never noticed the blue light until you talked about that.
It's really interesting because he's creating, like, the light source, the blue light source is the same so it indicates the space because you have the origin of the light. So that's one layer that influences you without thinking too much about it. The next one is like that blue and the pink of his skin, like the blue, quite electric, theatrical gel lighting, with a black interior, suggests a certain kind of architectural space, like the idea of a club or a nighttime context of performance. Right?
Yeah, I think that nightclub comment resonates with me because I see kind of, again, this dichotomy, this tension between two things, but in this case being between a kind of attraction, especially in a queer context, like Europhilia as an act.
Yeah.
But here it's made base, it's made gross, it's made more realistic,
Yeah.
Like something that's idealized in one's mind. It's like a sexy thing.
Yeah.
Maybe risque, but sexy nonetheless. Here is made disgusting, almost. There's that same kind of tension, which is referenced by the lighting as well.
It seems like both, if this was two parties and it was like a sexual act between two parties, nobody's having fun.
Yeah.
So it's kind of weird, like, why are they doing it?
It's also this endurance. It's like, it's a kind of sacrament or sacrificial kind of thing to it. A can I hack it kind of thing. And the willingness of, I think the other thing around sacrificial is this thing about opening the mouth. It's an extraordinarily vulnerable thing, and it's also within religious ritual, something that you're used to seeing in like communion or things like that. Opening the mouth to someone else is a very, very intimate. On the other hand, it's really funny.
Yeah.
So the skill of being able to just walk that edge between humor, disgust, All right. Here we have a cherry picker by Belkin. So you're kind of losing the sight line here because the cherry picker's here, but when you come around the corner, it actually is really pretty lively object. And so this is Eileen Emmanuel, and this piece is called Image Disturbance Pattern. And it's hand drawing using permanent marker and ink on acetate. And this, I think, is connected to Candace's work in the sense that the Google as a image generator is a technique that she uses, and then goes through this very methodical and labor-intensive process of drawing these images in this kind of schematized line drawing way in various colors. Then these large sheets of acetate were stitched together and folded and bent, working with the material's ability to hold its shape or to defy gravity. And this was the configuration that was the result of that quite long process working in the gallery. And then I think the final element of the work was really lighting it quite strongly in the center so that it takes on all of these refracted and reflected beams of light that allow you to see the layers of the drawing and to see the depth of it, and it also makes it very kind of violent in a way, like the feeling of that. I think we've all done that where we've like tried to crackle or crunch up a piece of acetate, and it's a material that fights back to a certain extent, but also the way that it folds, it makes these like sharp points that kind of have evoke a certain memory of like broken glass and things like that. So I think it's very much true to its material. I don't think it's trying to pretend to be something else, but I think there are these other layers of association with that work.
When you think about transparency, it's that what you normally shine light through, not shine light at or
Right.
on. So
Right.
there's a kind of reversal there.
Yeah, so the bounce back is, and so the effect of it is that it really takes up much more space and weight and volume than it really is. So it's quite fascinating. And I think when we go down to see her video installation, we really see these connections and how she's working. There's also, I would say, a layer at a level of refusal in this work, similar to Christian's work, in that we can't discern any of these beautiful drawings individually, or we can't actually, have an untroubled aesthetic experience with these drawings because they're all kind of like one on top of the other and organized in this way that discourages our pleasure. So the pleasure of it is on a different kind of plane, a different kind of register. It's sort of like a, whoa, what is this? I think when you first walk into space, and then kind of process of deconstructing what it is actually materially made of.
It's interesting because refusal seems to be a feature in a number of the works so far. I know we haven't gotten to it yet, but there's refusal here, there's refusal here, there's refusal in Christopher's work, and there also is in Candace's to some extent, being that the scrolls aren't completely
Yeah,
pulled out.
unrolled.
Are there images there
Yeah.
we aren't seeing? You don't know. So it's interesting that that's the thread.
And then this work is I think it's an associated work. It's called Manual for Disturbance, and it's human hair in paper in this archival box. So it's set up to encourage people to kind of leaf through these sheets with the gloves. So this kind of archival setup, but it's also on this transparent base, so it connects once again to the work on the floor and also to the video installation in the other room. Taking it out of the kind of slavish replication of an archival space into something else. And I don't know about you, but last thing I want to do is handle.
Is it because of the hair?
Kind of grosses me out, yeah. Yeah, no, it feels very like it's going to come off on me if I.
So everything that an archive does, which you want it in, you just want to get into the
Seduce,
documents,
yeah.
and you want to put on the gloves, and you want to turn everything over. This is also like, here's the gloves if you want to go for it.
It's interesting because in an archive, that's precisely what one does, right? Opens the box to access the documents.
Yeah.
And what is it that you see when you open it? Do you see documents or do you see people's lives? Like, do you see actual traces of people inside?
Yeah.
Yeah.
People also talk about the smell of old paper, and there's a revelatory kind of experience, and uncovering all the layers of history of a person's life. And here you have it, but nobody wants to actually take a look through it. There's also this reference to a coffin, kind of, on the bottom.
Oh yeah,
So-
interesting. I hadn't really thought of that.
Like
Yeah.
you're looking through a vitrine into someone's entombed
The
remains.
transparency is interesting, I think, because that often plays in some ways against what an archive can be.
Yeah.
That which is often opaque. Like every time you encounter a document or encounter a new file, it's like there's a not seeing there too at the same time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it also strikes me as like a commercial display, like something you would see in a store.
Oh, the base.
The base, yeah.
The base, yeah, absolutely. Well, that's
So
very
that's subverting the archive as well.
Yeah. And then this idea of, I think there's a suggestion of process over time. Whose hair is this? Is it the artist's hair? You know, that whole thing of the people collecting their hair, working with their hair as material, cutting your hair off, you know, to get rid of the last few years or whatever. That relationship that we have to hair, which is, hair is kind of like a clock of you know, bodily, the passage of time in the body. And so there's that accumulation as well, then it just embedding it in this, with this fibrous paper. Really deeply unsentimental. We think about Victorian era, people would use hair and make these beautiful brooches. They would clip hair of people that had just recently died and construct these like crocheted or tatted lace objects with their hair. It would be this memento of the loss of the lost relative, and very beautiful. And this is kind of like a complete antithesis of.
There's a piece like that at the Curator at Castle in Victoria, but it's a big picture. And I think it's like a basket of fruit, and it's all made of different coloured loops of hair.
It's astonishing.
So creepy.
Yeah.
But it's amazing. But it's very strange to look
Yeah.
at.
The Hastings Mill Museum has a few as well. Smaller ones. The Hastings Mill Museum,
Okay. Blah. All right. So, Cameron McClellan's work. So there's these 3 pieces, plus the wrapped trees outside And so with this work, I mean, I'm tired of doing all the work. Let's talk about what kinds of references are you picking up in this? Gamma.
So this is like a theatrical wall, false wall. And then the plastic stuff is used for sectioning off space when work is being done, like landscaping or architecture developments.
And we know that it's a false wall because it's not, it couldn't possibly be functional.
Yeah.
Its frame is too flimsy. The only thing that's holding it up is are these sort of struts in the back. So it's like a wall that makes a theater set or a film set. So you're talking about refusal with this work.
I mean, because just to me it seems to suggest that we're backstage. We're the kind of production assistant, you know?
Yeah.
And the refusal to me seems to be precisely that which lies on the other side, which you get a kind of hint at, but nonetheless you're always left with that kind of incomplete picture.
So whatever is being staged, it's not being staged for us. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or conversely, as people in the gallery, we're staging it for other people, right? Or the artist in this case is staging it for others.
Outside the gallery,
Yeah.
beyond the gallery.
Yeah. Or inside the gallery. Often people don't see what actually happens behind the scenes or when we're close to the public. So this is the stuff we normally see. We see all the back and forth, the running of the cable, everything all over the floor. We see all of that happening. We see these beautiful transparent sheets when they're laid out plainly on the floor, and now that we see them all sort of folded over on top of each other, this becomes something totally different. Here, maybe everything's still in process. We don't know if it's finished or not.
Yeah, I think it certainly speaks to the gallery context. Outside of a gallery, it would not deserve our contemplation in the same way. So it's set up for us to actively think about why are we on the other side of it, and exposing the kind of the workings. I mean, with sculpture, all you really have is gravity to work with, right? And so how this sculptural work is dealing with gravity is something that's made very transparent and very banal. And so connect them to these pieces. So these pieces are called sealed units. Ivory, Oxford ivory, Comox sage, Vancouver green, Kitsilano gold, Pendrell verdigris. And it's a glass, acrylic, aluminum, and silicone. So I think the titles really lay over a very specific and hyper-local set of references. Any thoughts about what they might be?
I think what's interesting about these color choices and the kind of names that they're attributed to them is that it points to the idea of heritage. They're all like heritage kind of colors that you'd expect to see on a home that's, you know, a heritage home by now. But in the context of Vancouver, that's complicated and troubled because it's often seen as a city that has little heritage, or a heritage that's not one that's, I don't know, a friendly one perhaps to some people. So I think that kind of tension comes through in the way that the piece has been created.
So naming the paint colors that way is really, it talks about what kind of heritage is being lauded and encouraged to be replicated and to be preserved.
Right.
Yeah. So there's not really Vancouver's special brown or
Precisely, right.
moldy stucco.
Yeah, how does
green.
something become heritage, and what kind of forces are at work in determining what counts as heritage, you know?
Mhm.
What kind of narrative does that suggest, like an official one or what have you?
But inside that, which is like a pretty indexical and pretty straightforward critique and commentary, aside from that, because he could just have done swatches, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
aside from that, there's this process going on of the paint, if we're to believe him, and I think we should, being injected into these double pane window containers and allowed to do what paint does. So it's kind of like this ant farm science experiment set up where the pigment is starting to separate from the binder. We're starting to see, you can see the wall from behind. You can see where the levels of it are perhaps falling, and the pigments within the mix are starting to separate from one another. So going back to it's like the original composition in a way, and then creating like a really pretty extraordinarily beautiful effect that I don't know. I was laughing with Cam the other day. It's just like abstraction. It always tends towards Rothko. Left to itself,
Yeah.
it leans towards Rothko. So you are set up with these like window panes into this very, very beautiful process. So combine that with the kind of prescribed idea of heritage and the prescribed, like I think by inference, the zoning and the conditions of housing within this very specific city, combine that then with this exploration of the very materiality of the paint is really interesting.
Yeah, it's almost over the passage of time. The paint settles, things separate into their different compartments in the same way that you're talking about the layering of, let's say, civic bureaucracy or the generation of a narrative, of particular narratives, and now things become a bit more transparent, if anything. I'm also thinking about the framing device, like the silicone or whatever it is that he's using to seal these isn't beautiful and pristine. It's kind of messy, kind of mucky, and that's kind of, I think also talks to the process of how history or art is also implicated in narratives. Yeah.
And I think I said this when I first saw the work, that it kind of reminds me of like a soil cross section.
Yeah.
That you can see the different strata, like you can trace
Oh, right, yeah.
those changes or that development over time. But then also as a sealed unit, is the title, it has its own environment inside the piece as well. Like,
Right.
I wonder if one was to shake it, like, is it kind of like entropy, like it would go together again and then fall apart again? Is it like
Yeah,
that system
there were
that's always...
toys like that were
It's like a sand.
those sand and
Sand
fluid
things,
things that
yeah,
you turn
yeah.
over. And,
Oh, yeah. I don't know if I'd go so far as to draw a direct metaphor between the separation and bureaucracy. I think for me, it's more about this, the overall structure, or these kind of conditions of real estate and housing and all the rest of it within this. And then inside that, the suggestion that, and living in a house, it doesn't matter where you live, you always think, these are really not the best materials, like, because things do go to entropy. Things do break apart. They do fall apart. They do go the way of all flesh, right? And that's sort of what I'm picking up about the paint, is that it's just doing what paint does when it's left in this condition. You know, it's going to peel if it's on a house. The gutters are going to fall down, right? So it's a kind of almost poignancy to the
Makes
work.
me think about the metaphor for the housing market of the bubble.
Oh yeah.
So like the way that like circumstances inside a sealed unit can kind of cause it to accelerate. But obviously like Vancouver's not hermeneutically sealed, so it's interesting that that is a metaphor for this kind of like the way that something in a particular region, sort of like an ecology or something, can get churned up or collapse or peak and then drop.
Yeah. Well, I think the market, as the way that currency works and the way that economics work, can be a sealed unit. The conditions can make it that. And then I guess there are formulas mathematical formulas within those conditions that lead to collapse or,
It's interesting, like units, that's often the word that is used to describe or refer to domestic spaces.
Yeah.
Like, what unit are you in?
Yeah, it's true. Great, okay. Now these, these are untitled from this year. And salvaged house paint and canvas thread. So they kind of suggest, I thought we were missing the drips, but they were there. They're just almost the same color as the floor. So referring to that kind of process of hand making candles. And these are salvaged paints, so the choice of colors were, I mean, he chose which cans to take out of the whatever paint recycling place, but the mix of them was not up to him, basically. And that process of like making a painting with this long thread also draws in, as the way it's like pulled away from the wall, and creates these kind of shadows and color shadows behind it, really draw the idea of the body engaged in that activity into our top layer of thinking. And so in that case we think about, well, you know, I need to stand on something in order to make that work. So we start to think about the mechanisms of their production in a really sculptural way. So for something that is so minimal and a very minimal repeated gesture, we're starting to imagine the whole apparatus of their making. And then the kind of trompe-l'oeil of the drips on the bottom adds this, I think, this other layer of humor in the work. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I don't know why, but maybe in relation to the last work we discussed, again, I come up against the question of layering. Like if I was to do a cross-section of these threads, I would see the different layers of paint. And if the pigment or the coloration had changed at all over time, like the exterior layer being darker or lighter because of the exposure to light than the bottommost layer. And so the idea of layering kind of comes up for me again. in this piece. So there seems to be a relationship between the two, not only because of the simple kind of material choice, but also like the number. There's both 5 pieces in either case.
And how do you know when to stop?
Right.
And so this, when we were talking before about, you know, gravity being the primary thing that you're dealing with as a sculptor, you know, this sense of volume and weight of these things. Is there a logic? Is there a point at which the linen thread wouldn't hold the weight? What went into the decision of stopping at a particular point? Okay. Something else that needs to be said that's not been said?
Do you want to take a look at Aileen's last piece on the end?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can go there, and then we can have a look at the tree wraps.
Oh, great.
So aside from the really obvious things about the connection between the work and the room and the use of plexi, there's sort of the plexi base, and this kind of refraction of image. Now we have it operating in space, so it's kind of like we're inside those diagrams in a fun way. And it feels very, not precarious, but it feels conditional how it's set up right now. We can imagine it being set up in an infinite number of ways within this space, that the reflections could, you know, the ceiling, it could, you know, occupy the space in a different way. So this is one possible iteration of the work. So it's also really destabilizing and unstable in the same way that those folds are, the material is holding itself up. It could be reconfigured in a number of ways and still have a similar effect. So within the image, we're also, I think, just seeing a part of a video image. We're not seeing the full screen. So there's been this choice to like crop So it seems like there's something like an interior, and then there's a moving image that is being shot inside that interior. There's a figure that is doing sign language, but you can only see one hand, so you can't actually tell what is being communicated or translated. So once again, we've got this sense of refusal and resistance to a really immediate or literal interpretation. So what that leaves us with is the apparatus, the mechanism, and the kind of effects, so like the color.
It's also like stained glass that you can create the image on sort of stained glass field that might be in a CD or a projected already on the wall. So it's making the sort of layers that the images have to pass through more.
So breaking and kind of scattering elements of that projection. And when you're actually, say, from here, starting to look back at the lens, you can actually see where it first hits on the plexiglass is quite out of focus. It's quite abstracted. It's really quite painterly. And I think the stained glass or painterly aspects of it also, when you move around it, every now and then you get a sort of reflected beam of light back in your face, similar to the kind of geographical terrain of the other piece that every now and then the light will just flash back in your eyes.
It's interesting that all three of Ivy's work in this show also deal with the problem or the question of the hand.
Right.
So in the diagrams, all of those drawings are painstakingly done by hand. And here there's kind of in opposition to that a refusal of the hand in the making of the work. But what appears in the work itself are hand gestures. And even with the work of the hair and the paper, like you're invited to incorporate your own hand into the work.
Right.
To use it yourself. So
Yeah, it's a good point. And the meaning is kind of fractured across, so you can in this image where I'm standing right now, start to see the part of these hand gestures of sign language in this really quite precise little moment. But there's absolutely no way that you can connect that with that and still be able to read the image together.
So the full image is coming out of the projector when it's being broken apart in structures. But it's still like the whole image. It's not that like a partial image is being projected, but the full image is projected, and then it's broken apart as things.
Yep. The whole image is being projected, but I think the frame that was shot was like a part of a room with a screen, so maybe a computer screen, etc.
Did you talk about what the language was or what's actually being communicated in the, is it a videograph or is it a court proceeding or does that matter to?
I think it's video for social media, and I'm not sure if that is, like a really important detail to her. But similarly with the sound score, which she constructed, it's a white noise that is just a bunch of different sound scores like compressed together into central therefore white noises. So it's also this thing about it's there as material, but the other interpretive layers or other layers of meaning are being left out. So we have to focus on the kind of physical, aesthetic, phenomenological effect of the installation and not the source material itself necessarily.
Just based on the earlier work items that I've seen.
What's that?
Just based on like earlier work items that I've seen, this could be like an Iranian television from the 70s. And it might be like a news broadcast or a political broadcast. She had a similar piece that was just that. But she was really interested in sort of square within square as the interpretation.
Yeah. So language upon language upon language, yeah. Because there's also the captions that are part of the.
Those are the things that I like, the dress, it kind of base it a little bit, and the blue background, so there's some information about the period, but.
But she hasn't gone out of her way to make that explicit. In fact, she's put a lot of filters in how it's shot and in how it's installed. So there, yeah, all manner of filters and obstructions and redirections of attention. Pretty awesome. It's quite beautiful. So letting go of the specific meaning of it, this is, in particular, is a really beautiful manifestation. Implicates the architecture, makes you think about these struts in a different way, like the triangularity of it, and how they kind of function as a three-dimensional screen. Cool. Okay, so right at the front, there's a frame drawing of the cans. So in this kind of architectural style of drawing, it's even drawn on a kind of on transparency. Is the front of the gallery with the 3 oak trees that are 3 different sizes. And so that's what almost functions like a title card when you come into the gallery after having seen them.
Okay, any ideas? You know, what strikes me first, this is the first time I've actually seen them this way, is that I had a really strong reaction to this first little tree because of all the other shoots and the branches that are being pushed out, and I feel that there's this sort of
Suffocation.
yeah, which I don't get in the other ones. Were you here? Was anybody here when he was installing? Yeah?
Yeah, it was.
Any ideas or what he was talking about, or do you have any clues?
I didn't speak to him about it.
How about you, Michael?
No, I didn't think about it. I took some pictures of it earlier today, but
It's interesting because I don't know if I would even recognize this gesture was made by an artist if I were walking by.
oh,
I would think it would have something to do with the trees themselves, some sort of like, I don't know, like landscape or arboreal. Yeah, I don't know if I would first associate that, but once you come inside, I think it's made clear by the image at the front, but also by his work in the gallery space that uses the same kind of orange plastic fencing.
yeah. Well, there's also a subversion too, or because this kind of orange fencing, you see it all over the campus. It's used to put up walls around trees to protect them, and putting it in contact with the tree is kind of the opposite of that. It does nothing to protect the tree. It's
Either that or they're severely damaged and they need to be bandaged or something.
I think it's interesting though because at the same time it does the opposite of what his flat wall piece does inside. Meaning, in this case, like, we have to question which side of this fence that we're on again. Is that doing harm to the tree, or is it meant to protect the tree kind of from us as actors who could potentially damage the tree, but are encouraged to stay away from the tree by this intervention?
Yeah, I think like on UBC campus and in the endowment lands, there's been a lot of like ecological restoration and stuff. So you get these boundaries being like, do not go in here, like you are not welcome here.
Right.
You're gonna mess up the nature.
Right.
So you get this kind of like, it's definitely, this orange material is a tool for sectioning off space and telling you, so indicating where you're allowed and where you're not allowed.
Absolutely. I mean, the color connotes that sentiment, caution, danger,
Acton.
warning.
Safety or something.
Yeah.
It kind of looks like a bandage when it's wrapped around these trees. Like a gauze, medical gauze. But then it also makes me think about, like, in my hometown, for some reason the council went crazy and decided they were going to cut down like a third of all the trees in the city. And you drive around the city and they've all been marked with like tape or flagging tape or like spray paint or something. And it's you look at the tree and you're like, that tree is condemned. So it's there's a sort of tension between like you said, like is the tree being protected or.
I mean, when you think about material too, like up against the piece inside, that's wood that's also been wrapped with this plastic. But this is how that wood appeared before it was cut.
Yeah,
So
there's-
This is the live wood, that's the dead.
yeah,
that's
it's
the
that
sacrifice
same
wood.
kind of contrast or tension.
Yeah,
I think
not
between
that
the two
anybody
pieces.
would really get this, but when they changed the road here from one that you could drive on to pedestrian only, that's when these little trees, big ones that preceded them, got killed because they dug up all the roots
Yeah,
and the trees died.
yeah, yeah, there was a large tree here,
Yeah.
as there was a large tree beside the fire hydrant.
Yeah, and
And
over
the
there
roots
as
were
well.
down. Yeah.
And some of the other ones, the ones that survived, were not too happy about it either. Like you can see there's big chunks that were, but the middle ones, half the trees been cut away. Because it was really, really unhealthy.
I guess it's making me think about the way space is engineered and like nature is engineered, and like we don't usually have an aesthetic of that. Is it like the 17th century or 18th century formal gardens anymore? We like a kind of like naturey aesthetic, but it's been equally engineered most of the time. Like
Oh yeah, so
Capability Brown.
yeah, landscaping on campus is like one of the largest budget line items. And if you're here on campus throughout the year, there are people working on trees, flower beds, everything, all the
Every
time.
day.
And so it is tended to. I think, and in this way, there is this sort of main wall, this line of trees that borders either side of the east side and the west side, and it really is meant as sort of like this large avenue which you can stroll down.
and then you look this way and it's like, oh, a landscape painting, like Group of Seven, or even just the way it's framed. With a big Canadian flag in the middle.
So I guess the orange kind of disrupts that idea of the constructed boulevard that we want things are picturesque.
Yeah, it definitely is not picturesque. Yeah. Okay, any other questions before we go? Any comments? Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks, Michael.